5 minutes later, we're called back into the room and John says, we've all resigned. Like, sorry? Yeah, we've decided we don't like being told what to do by shareholders, so we're all going. So that left the chief executive, me, and the COO. This is a listed company. Market is open, by the way. So we're in breach of the listing rules at this point.
My guest today is Dame Anne Richards. Dame Anne is currently Chair of Coutts, a non-executive director of Land Securities, Chair of the CETIUK Leadership Council, a member of the European Advisory Panel for Temasek, a director of the Institute of International Finance, and senior advisor to Fidelity International.
I mean, when you're running a business, the organization sucks the energy from you. You are the battery for the organization, and you're the source of energy for the organization. And I think sometimes boards forget that. They forget what that energy sort of drawdown constantly is with the chief executive.
She was chief executive of Fidelity International from 2018 to 2024, during which time assets under management grew to over $700 billion, before transitioning to vice chair and then to her current senior advisor role in January this year.
Boards jump from puddle to puddle. As a chief executive, you're in the stream the whole time.
Welcome to Enter the Boardroom, the podcast for boards and board members. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Neural, home to the Enter the Boardroom community, the destination for serving and aspiring board directors. If you're ready, I'm going to get going.
I was born ready.
Good start. Dame Anne, welcome to Enter the Boardroom.
Thank you. Wonderful to be here.
Can we start by talking about your executive experience of the boardroom? I'd be really interested if you could maybe share with us 3 moments from your executive career that have most shaped how you operate today in the boardroom.
Okay, it's always interesting to try and distill various different moments of your life down into little nuggets like that. But I suppose the first one that I would draw out is, it's not one as an individual thing, but it's one as the team that I was part of, which was the Aberdeen Asset Management experience. And I came into Aberdeen by accident in a way, which we might come back to in my third moment. But it was very formative for me in a number of different ways. The first is that Aberdeen, when I came into it, was very much a founder-led business. So Martin Gilbert, who had done the original buyout sort of 20 odd years before and had, built a team around about it. And eventually, we took Aberdeen, I think, all the way to the FTSE 100 in 2011, which for a business that started out as a £50 million trust, this is a quite extraordinary achievement. One thing that I really took away from all of that time was Martin's ability to build trust with his executive team and with the board was quite remarkable. And it's only in latter situations where I've worked in a lower trust environment that I realized actually how unique and special that was. So I think partly it is because he was a founder and he led that. We also did a ton of acquisitions over that period. I mean, I joke about this, but sometimes when I can't get to sleep at night, I try and count through the different acquisitions that we did. And I rarely get beyond around about 10. And I know we did more than that. So it's just a kind of mind game that you go through. But Martin did in each and every one of those. And, we made a ton of mistakes going through that. I think we got more right than we got wrong in that period. But one of the things that Martin always did was he would figure out who within the executive team of the business we were buying was the person we really needed to bring into the tent, and he would absorb them into his exco. And so the exco, if you looked around the table, was built by people who kind of bought into the vision and the ambition of what we were trying to do, but in a collegiate way, not in a way that meant everybody agreed with each other, because actually quite a lot of the time they didn't agree with each other, but it was a high trust environment. And the board backed Martin. So the non-executives and Martin had a great bond of trust because they'd been through so much in the early part of the business. And again, that is rare, I think, as I've gone through life, to have that degree of trust, which then gives you, I think, an appetite for change. So it was quite a change-seeking organization. But, quite often in organizations, and maybe this will resonate with people, you find organizations are actually quite fearful of change. They want everybody else to change, but they do not want to change themselves. That's a very frequent message that comes out from surveys, for example. Aberdeen was the opposite. Aberdeen was like when something new was on the cards, there was a kind of, well, hey, we're off again. And again, that energy and that enthusiasm meant you got stuff done and over the line really quite quickly. So, we went through a bunch of crises together, from SARS, .com all the way through to financial crisis and Eurozone and all sorts of other stuff. But it was a team that pulled together, not pulled apart in a crisis. And that's more exceptional, I realise now, than I knew it was at the time when I was part of the team.
Brilliant. Well, I'd love to deep dive on that in a second, but can you give me two other executive experiences that have shaped how you operate as a non-executive?
So one of the things that you see, and I wear a CIO hat, because remember, I started life as a fund manager, and that's how ultimately ended up, running fund management businesses. And one of the things that you end up with when you're a CIO is, for example, the chair of the REMCO wants to come in and talk to you about his 30-page remuneration report, which is really not the most exciting thing you're ever going to do as a CIO. And you get quite a lot of those sorts of conversations. And I think where that shaped my understanding is you can tell good boards know where to focus their time. And the thing that they want to come in and talk to you about quietly and behind closed doors and sometimes even behind the Chinese wall, good boards, that's important stuff. Less well-functioning boards, it's not important stuff. The third event goes back to, I mentioned at the start, I accidentally ended up in Aberdeen because it wasn't part of my life plan to end up at Aberdeen. I had been running quite a successful investment management team at Mercury Asset Management, which is a name that some of you may remember, eventually became a key part of BlackRock in the end. And I got a call about a small fund management business based in Edinburgh, which is where I'm originally from. That's a coincidence, that needed a CIO. And it was going to be a board position, which is great, first time on a board, and I'd be CIO, arms around everything. So although it wasn't a huge business, much smaller than Mercury, it was nonetheless, it gave me a bunch of different things. So I handed in my resignation and off I trotted with my little briefcase in hand. And that's great because we had a new chair who had been partly responsible for persuading me to come to EFM, chief executive, Ian Watt. Small team, it was great. 6 weeks in, so I've been on the board, in board terms, about 2 minutes. 6 weeks in, the chairman decided that I was ready to be taken out to see our main shareholders. And we had quite a concentrated shareholder register. Biggest shareholder, 30%. The next 3 or 4 together were another 25%. So off we trot down to London, my little presentation about my thinking about our investment offering and all those sorts of good things. And pretty much the first meeting we had was to go into the M&G offices, open bracket, where I ended up as chief executive sometime later, close bracket, bear that thought in mind. But anyway, so John and I go in and we sit down in front of their corporate governance team, and we are, across the table, handed a letter. This is not normal. I can just say this in a shareholder meeting. That is not normal. So in silence, John carefully opened this letter, and we were both wondering, is it going to say they don't like us and they want us to go away and fire us? But it didn't say that. It said we have enough shareholder votes to requisition an EGM to remove the chief executive and 2 of the 4 non-executives. So not me or the chairman, but 3 others on the board. It's like, okay. New territory, people, new territory. So we dutifully take the letter and say, well, we'll think about this. What else do you say, right? So trot back to Edinburgh, and John calls a board meeting, and I think there were 4 or 5 non-execs in total, and the 3 executive directors, the chief executive, the CIO, and the COO, CFO combined. So we're all in the board meeting. And then John says, I think we need a meeting with just the non-execs. Okay, so the 3 executives dutifully leave the room. 5 minutes later, we're called back into the room. And John says, we've all resigned. Like, sorry? We've decided we don't like being told what to do by shareholders, so we're all going. Okay, so they all go. So that left the chief executive, me, and the COO as this is a listed company. Market is open, by the way. The only directors, so we're in breach of the listing rules at this point. So, and we've been on the board apart from Ian 2 minutes, and we still have this letter that's requisitioning an EGM with 56% of the votes to get rid of the chief executive. So the EGM is going to pass and get rid of him. So, okay, so we then ask Ian to leave the room, and we call our legal advisor in. We said to him, Bruce, okay, what do we do? And he said, you just sack him and we'll work everything else out afterwards. And so with due respect to Ian, who's actually a lovely guy, we then called him back in and said, really sorry, Ian, but we're going to have to ask you to go. So fine, he says, okay, so off he goes. That leaves 2 of us. So in the course of an afternoon, we've lost all of our executive directors and the chief executive, non-executive directors and the chief executives. So anyway, long story short, we think, right, we've got to get an announcement back. There's a whole rinky-dink with our financial advisor, but anyway, we get through all of that. Rod and I get back to the office. It's 3:30. The market's still open for an hour. We have to get an announcement out that night because by good luck or bad luck, we have every single client of the company, all the investment trust directors, everybody coming for dinner in the office that night. So we had to get it out to the market, otherwise we would have had to cancel the dinner. So we got the announcement out to the market, and we then, we're kind of breathing fumes by this stage, running on adrenaline, and we say to our clients, really terribly sorry about this, but inconveniently we've lost our entire board and our chief executive, but don't worry, it'll all be fine. So anyway, so that's quite a long story short. That was quite formative.
Wow. I can imagine an Enter the Boardroom listener listening to this and thinking, oh my gosh, if I'm sitting there as a board member and the rest of the board have just resigned in that situation, what on earth do I do? You've been through that situation. What would your advice be to them now, having been through it? So,
when I look back, so we're talking more than 20 years ago, right? So, I was in my 30s. Rod and I were both in our 30s. We were babies. We were kids. First board position, really didn't, Actually, in a way that played to our advantage. We got a massive sympathy vote because anybody who realized what had happened realized that here were these two folks who were desperate to do the best that they possibly could. We were running on adrenaline. We understood the urgency of the stuff that we had to get through. But the clients were unbelievable. They really lent in. So we got a big sympathy vote from the clients and effectively verbal assurance, right? As long as you keep the show on the road, we're not going to do anything stupid. So advice would be, first of all, make sure your business can still run. So, that was, and then, we drew on quite a few favors. That was we were able to, I mentioned the financial advisors, so John Waddle, he was fantastic because, he helped us and held our hand. Even though actually arguably he shouldn't have, but he was willing to do that and put his own personal situation in jeopardy in order to make sure that we did what we needed to do and in the right way in terms of dealing with the market. And then we knew we had to get a board very quickly. So again, I called a headhunter and said, help. We need to find a really good quality chair. And they found us Sir Charles Nunnally, fantastic pedigree, who then put Rod and me through an absolute grilling and then agreed, for love nor money, to come in and then help us put together a board and steer us through everything that had happened, have the EGM, or at least tell shareholders we didn't need to have the EGM, but keep the show on the road. So, don't be afraid to call a friend.
You talked earlier about Martin's ability to build trust in that boardroom in a unique way. What was it, practically speaking, that he did that board members listening might be able to learn from?
he's super smart and he understands a deal, right? So, I mean, his gut instinct is very astute. And also, if he says he's going to deliver something, he usually gets there. So I think that trust was in part born because quite a few of them had been with him through that journey over the previous period of time to get to where the business was. Now, he made mistakes, split capital investment trust, for those of you who remember that. And, Aberdeen over the years, of course, has made mistakes. It's not saying that it was I left in 2015, beginning of 2016, by the way. I'm just going to put that one out there in case ever you do dates. But he could execute. And he was quite fun. So he built trust through his personal relationships and through his ability to execute. And he doesn't tend to get fussed by the little stuff. So, it's a longevity point. I mean, sometimes I think, I sometimes roll around in my mind the kind of 9-year rule that we have with non-execs in the UK. I sometimes roll around in my mind questioning whether we don't have enough tenure, because it really is length of relationships and seeing somebody deal with crisis after crisis after crisis that is in part builds your trust and your ability to execute. And as a non-executive board, understanding how your executive is going to execute is a really important part of it. We sometimes forget that when we talk about governance, it's about governing, it's about actually getting things done. And so I think tenure and seeing how something goes through a cycle is quite an important part of building trust.
You talked about the agility of the culture and its receptiveness to change. It feels like in the current climate, that's going to be something really important for all organizations to have, navigating the sort of macroeconomic and AI disruption. Is there something you've taken from that experience that you now use as a board member and think about as a board member getting into the organizations you work with?
Well, so I think there is that. I think appetite for change comes from an environment of trust and the energy of the executive team. I mean, executive teams need to have high energy. I mean, when you're running a business, the organization sucks the energy from you. You are the battery for the organization, and you're the source of energy for the organization. And I think sometimes boards forget that. They forget what that energy sort of drawdown constantly is with the chief executive. Addendum, you need to make sure your chief executive has spaces to refill the batteries. So if you don't have a high energy CEO, I think you're more likely to have a change-averse organization, because organizations feed off of their executive team's energy. And when they're energized, they're more likely to be able to contemplate change and doing something differently, and because that needs energy. So there's definitely a virtuous circle in how you create a high energy environment that then creates an environment that has the capacity to innovate and to change and to move forward and to do things differently and to pivot when something comes out of left field, which it seems to do more and more frequently.
It's a really interesting concept of refueling a CEO as a board member. For someone listening thinking about, gosh, how do I go about doing that as a board member? What would your advice, or can you give us examples of where you've seen people doing that and how they've gone about it?
Well, part of it is how you address your questions. You can address a question to a chief executive in a positive way. That is fabulous. I have never been able to imagine an idea like this before. Can you just walk me through actually practically what that will mean versus, I really don't get that. It sounds to me something that's really a bit different to what anyone else is doing. Is that, you sure that's the right thing to do? I mean, you can ask the same question in a bunch of different ways. There's also about, so I think that's one thing, just always think about the framing, because there's nothing more draining than when you come with a brilliant idea and everybody looks a bit meh around the table, and you think, hang on a minute, am I missing something? Or, so then you have to put your energy into persuading them. And even if you get them there, it's taking a bit of the joy out. So make sure as a board that you challenge without taking the sort of energy and the joy out when you scrutinise. And then also be careful about nitpicking. I mean, and I'm not saying don't have a great attention to detail. Absolutely. I had to learn this, by the way. I like precision and stuff. But, you don't need to point out every tiny mistake. You need to focus on the things that matter, where you really need to understand or need to, if there is a genuine contradiction. But sometimes, just knowing when to ask a question, how to ask a question, and when there's something that, in fact, you could just ask quietly offline. And, if it's actually a mistake, but it doesn't matter, you don't always need to pull it out. So, it's a bit like with your kids, right? Isn't it? If you're always on at them, always criticising, always correcting them, eventually they don't listen to anything. A bit like that with CEOs and boards. So you have to give the energy to the CEO and not suck the energy from them yourself. So give the CEO a bit of joy, so that they have the energy to go on.
Less than 10% of board roles go through a search firm. The rest are filled by word of mouth through networks built up over years of operating at board level. If you're new to the board world, you're almost certainly invisible to the people filling those roles. That's not a reflection of your ability, it's just how the market works. The Enter the Boardroom community puts you inside a concentrated network of chairs and board members, the connections that turn into opportunities. Visit etb.newroll.com to find out more. Before we move on to talk about your non-executive experience, a couple more questions on your executive experience on the board. First one is, when's the moment when you've seen a board member add most value for you as a chief executive?
Add most value. A board member said to me as we were going into a market downturn, remember, revenues are a product of hope. Costs are a product of willpower. That's quite helpful, actually. Right, you may or may not get your revenues, but your costs you can control. And you shouldn't forget that in your search for margin. So, yeah.
And if you could go back in time and sit on one of your boards where you were a CEO as an independent non-exec, what's the challenge or input that you didn't get at the time that you wish you'd got?
Well, I'll turn it around a little bit differently, which is, I think what I didn't realise as a chief executive, or it took me a long time to realise, and I wish an experienced non-exec had said this to me earlier, was to remind me that boards jump from puddle to puddle. As a chief executive, you're in the stream the whole time. The board jumps in and out, meets monthly or quarterly or whatever it is, but it's not living the dream the whole time. So in my innocence, I used to think, well, if I told the board that, surely they should know that. But boards forget. They forget what the discussion was because they're not living it day in, day out. And therefore, as a chief executive, you have to repeat, reiterate, remind, restate the case, go back and remind people why we're on this journey.
Is that a reflection on the board members? Because I remember reading, there's a great piece by Reid Hoffman who talked about the best board members he's ever worked with. And one of the characteristics he highlights is they're able to pick up the conversation where you last left it off. And I guess it's because they're taking meticulous notes in the meeting, and then before they come back to the meeting, they're reading them again before the meeting.
Yeah.
So is that actually just a failure on the part of those board members? Or is there another reason behind that means you need to keep repeating to people?
Look, I think it's a failure on both. I would say, as an executive, if the board don't remember, that is at least partially a failure on me. And I don't want to cast nasturtiums around, as they say. I don't want to say that, but yeah, it's a failure on both parts. If a board doesn't really remember, and there is this thing about agreeing to something and committing to something. boards agree to stuff, but sometimes it's easy to make the mistake of assuming that there's therefore deep commitment to something. And, when you're making big, meaty decisions, you need deep commitment. And otherwise, what you get is sort of hindsight.
Let's move on to talk about your non-executive experiences. You took on your first non-executive role almost over 2 decades ago. Across all the non-exec roles you've had, what's been the hardest single situation you've faced?
The hardest situation as a non-exec? Well, changing a chief executive's quite hard. Even when everybody agrees, it's the right time, contracts all line, even, when it's not a bad leaver situation, but it's just time. And even when the leaver is content, when you found the new incumbent, it's a bit like, with Doctor Who, and when there are rifts in the fabric of space and time and kind of things come through, you do tend to find in these interregnums that people, because there's change coming, people's behavior changes a little bit. And actually, even when it's an amicable change, that's quite a dangerous time for the board. So I found I was quite on tenterhooks going through that whole process to make sure that we didn't mess anything up on the outgoing, and we landed well on the incoming, and everybody behaved through that process.
It's a recurring theme in Enter the Boardroom, and I think it's probably the single most valuable contribution you can make as a board and board member of getting that CEO right. Listeners will face that situation if they haven't already. What's your playbook in that situation? What's the advice you can give someone listening facing that situation about how to navigate it most effectively, having been through it?
Well, I mean, I would not claim to be the world's expert on it, because the reality is you don't get that many goes at doing it, do you? So, you get a few goes and you hope you get it right. I think honest conversations really help. So honest with the outgoing, honest with the incoming. There's a tendency to, with the incoming, you can either paint everything that the predecessor has done is terrible, or everything that they've done is wonderful. And either of those are equally constraining to the incoming. So being realistic about that. And then I think trying to stay connected to the level below the chief executive. They get really anxious about whether they're going to be loved and needed or not. So honesty with them without hamstringing the incoming about what he can and cannot do with the executive team that he has or she has. I mean, I think that's the best advice that I can give, is be honest, be present. You've got to be there to handhold. And that's one of those really interesting balancing acts I think you do as a chair. It's knowing when to step in and knowing when to step out. Because you're not supposed to be in the swim the whole time, right? You're not. The clue is in the non-exec bit of the non-exec. And sometimes I think some chairs feel they have to be ever present. That is stultifying. But you do also need to know when you have to lean in, when you have to hold hands, and that's a people reading exercise. And you've got to listen to people. You've got to try and read the body language. I'm a great believer in trying to learn how to read body language, because it usually tells you more than the words do. So you try and watch for the microsignals. Who's really happy with that? Who's not happy with that? That's the best advice I can give, is be honest and be clear.
Dame, time has flown, which means it's time for the lightning round, where I'm going to ask you
scary.
A short question and ask you for a quick response, if you're ready.
I'll do my best.
Best book every board member should read, and why?
The first is Adam Grant's Think Again, partly because he's very, very funny and he's very thought-provoking. But it's also about, he talks about beliefs should be subject to revision, you should treat them as drafts, not as sort of tombstones almost. And then the second one, and maybe this comes because I've spent so much of my career in international organizations, and vast majority of my time has been spent in really international books. It's Laura Liswood's The Loudest Duck. And where does that title come from? In China, the loudest duck gets shot. In America, the squeaky wheel gets oiled. And it's just a beautiful little microcosm of how cultures reward different behaviors and how different groups of people might interpret the same series of events, the same series of statements totally differently. So 2 books, I think, really useful for boards, particularly for international companies.
Boardroom behaviour that irritates you most?
Board directors falling asleep in a boardroom. That'd be the first one. Second one, grandstanding.
A question every board should ask annually?
Are we still going to be here a year from now?
A boardroom myth to bust?
Well, a thing that I don't like, not sure it's the same thing, but I hate this thing. Send all your questions in advance, and so we'll get you written answers to all of them, so then we can get through the board really quickly. I think that's a good way of stopping discussion. So I'm not if it's trivial details on the minutes, of course, do that. But, not things of substance. I think they need to be in the boardroom. By all means, say, I think this is really important. We need to talk about it. But, yeah.
Favourite quote?
Victory is not always to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, which I think is from Solomon, actually. But that's the way to place your bets.
What have you changed your mind on about boards over time? That's an Adam Grant-inspired question.
Small boards work better.
So what have you changed?
So I would have originally said, you want loads of different views around the table, you want big groups, you want to do all of that. And I think that's still true. But if you're going to create a trusted environment, I think there is a size beyond which trust is really difficult to get. And I kind of ally that with the other bit of that thinking. So it's about taking accountability is sometimes you can sit there as a board director when there's a lot of people around the table. Nobody else has asked the question, I'm sure it's fine. And the more people you have around the table, I think the more likely you are to have that situation where actually there can be something staring in plain sight. But perversely, if there's fewer people, you think, well, I'm not going to take the risk. I really am going to ask that question. Last
significant judgment call you got wrong in the boardroom, and what did you learn?
Well, I think I've talked about that one a little bit already, but it was believing that because the board had agreed to something, that they were actually committed to it. And I won't go into details because it's still too live for that. But getting that deep commitment from a board, again, I think sometimes with big decisions, you get the bystander effect. And then when you hit one of those more difficult scenarios, sometimes, board directors kind of back away from, you need to be reminded why you agreed it and that you did agree it and that you did more than agree to it, you committed to it. And that's the implication of that.
Best interview question for a prospective non-exec?
When was the last time you changed your mind and what was it?
What does a good answer look like?
It's more about, do they think about reversing out of a position? So it's more about seeing how they think through that.
And finally, if our listeners take just one thing from this episode, nothing else, what should it be?
Well, look, no business has a survival guarantee attached to it. And if you look at the data, most businesses don't survive for more than a few decades at best. Almost no boards sit down and say, what is going to cause us to go out of business? What is our right to survive? What could put us out of business? So the one thing I'd say to everybody, just really be clear about, think about that question. You won't get the answer right, but thinking about that question, what could put us out of business, will help you at least design scenarios where you might have some options if some unexpected threat turns up.
Dame Anne, thank you so much for taking the time to share your experience and wisdom. So we'll open up for questions. Please raise your hand and we'll pass or throw the microphone around.
Thank you so much to both of you. My name is Parul Agrawal, and the two things that really resonated with me were acquisitions and change, given I've been with General Electric for 19 years. I wanted to ask you, with your experience as non-exec, how you've been able to influence cultures across the organizations that you've been at.
Golly, culture, that's a whole topic in and of itself. So culture is a very catch-all phrase, and it's actually a catch-all word. It's one I've always slightly struggled with a little bit, because, you know, I never wanted my Paris office to feel identical to my Milan office, to feel identical to my Tokyo office. You know, they've all got their unique sort of cultures and environments, and I want, you know, that's part of the richness of an international business, is that you've got those differences. So you don't want to sort of remove those inherent cultural differences, I don't think. But there are some things you need to be absolutely shared. So I tended to talk more about values and behaviours. And I was always really clear that, you know, we needed to be explicit about the values and behaviours. So at Fidelity, we did actually quite a big piece of work. I did this at M&G as well, just thinking about what are the words that matter for us now. And I think words are really powerful, and they need to be repeated often and often, over and over again. So we talked about, you've got to act with integrity to build trust. So those are your values, because trust without integrity is meaningless. Integrity without trust, you know, what's the point? So you have to have both of those, trust and integrity, and they have to go hand in hand. So that's non-negotiable. And then the behaviours that, when I came in, that I felt we needed, they needed to be simple words that were translatable into multiple different languages, that we could come back and touch on again and again and again and be relevant to our business. And at that time, what I needed, this was in 2018, I needed people to be brave and bold, curious and compassionate. Those were the 4 words. I said, that's, if you do those things, you know, we're going to, so look at how you're behaving. Does it align with those? So I've tended to talk about values and behaviours and be explicit about the behaviours that I wanted, because if people have the right values and they're behaving in the right way, I think you will get the culture that you want across the organisation, without saying Paris has to be the same as Milan, has to be the same as Tokyo. So that's how I've tended to think about it. And I don't think the values really change. I think the words might change. You know, if I were redoing the exercise again today, that's whatever it is, 8 years later, we might have different words that we needed to, you know, to focus on, and which is okay. It's not saying they're the only things that matter, but they're the things that we need you to do. We need you to be a bit braver about facing into change. We need to be bolder. You need to be bolder about the actions that you're going to take, and so on. So that's how I've tended to think about it.
We've got time for one last question.
I'm actually taking Coast's perks and taking the last questions. I hope that's all right. But mine's a practical question, maybe perhaps on behalf of some people here, but around if you haven't done a board role yet, and if you look at, you know, doing lots of reading about roles, but you haven't got the experience, so quite often it will say, ideally people have had board experience. How do you get on this journey?
Well, look, there are a lot, and, you know, you're all brilliant place for doing this. I mean, one of the things that, you know, Fiona and I did right at the beginning when you went and started on that journey was we tried to bring more transparency to board roles, because there was an awful lot of board role stuff that was really kind of behind a curtain. It was quite hard to see. So there is more transparency. And so that's the first place. You can actually see where there are boards that need people. And yes, most boards would love to have really experienced non-execs, but obviously everyone, as you say, has to start somewhere. Quite a lot of smaller boards struggle to find good directors with good experience that is relevant for them. And that's, you know, so if you've got a bit of a finance background, often that's something that they're looking for. You know, you can help them with some elements of strategy. So, I mean, I think starting with a not-for-profit, an industry trade body, starting with, you know, a subsidiary board of an entity, if you're with a big entity. There are all other ways where you can start to get a little bit of experience.
Could I be very cheeky and take a new role prerogative and just ask a quick question of Anne? So I'm Caroline Turner, and Anne, you are an exceptional person, and you are an exceptional woman, one of very, very few CEOs over a significant time period, particularly in financial services, and now an exceptional chair in financial services as a woman. Is there any one piece of advice, candidly, that you would give women in this room to enable them to build their resilience against perhaps some of the challenges you may have faced as a woman building that career?
I'm going to give advice to men and the women in the room. I think it applies equally. The higher you go in an organisation, the more brickbats get chucked at you. Now you can argue do men get more, do women get more, whatever, but you have to learn to deal with people who criticize, people who have different views, people who just don't like you because you're telling them telling them what to do, whatever it might be. So you have to develop a bit of a thick skin. So I talk about 3 things that every person needs to keep in their gender-neutral handbag. So the first thing is the ladder of leadership, right? One of the ways that you feel, I think, stronger in yourself is by helping other people. So always think about the person who's one step further down, one rung further down in the ladder, and carve out a little bit of time to help that person. Because that is one of the things that actually weirdly, maybe it's developing your core, I don't know, but it helps you, not because they're necessarily your cheerleader, because actually you realize that you have power, you have influence. So, always remember the ladder of leadership. The second thing is what I call the lipstick of power, and it's invisible, so nobody need know that you're wearing it. But the lipstick of power is an invisible lipstick that you put on, which empowers you to be the expert, right? I mean, who in the room hasn't suffered from imposter syndrome? Who in the room hasn't sat there and thought, God, I should know this and I don't, and everybody else knows it and I feel really inadequate. I don't know that I can do this job, all of those emotions. The lipstick of power just reminds yourself that actually you do know a lot. You might not know everything, but you do know a lot. You're probably in the room because other people think you know quite a lot. And you just need to remind yourself of that. And so the lipstick of power, so the ladder of leadership, the lipstick of power. And then the final thing is the cloak of invincibility. So not invisibility, invincibility. And it's like a Teflon cloak that you put on, because when you're wearing it, when you sit up to do something like this, I put it on before I got up here. So if Ollie asked me any really nasty questions that really hurt me or made me feel deeply inadequate, I didn't care because they would just slide off of me. So, it's your resilience point. So that's it, your ladder of leadership, your lipstick of power, your cloak of invincibility, keep them in. And on those horrible days where you get home and you just think, why am I doing this? I've got to get up tomorrow and do it all over again. You just go into your handbag and kind of have a play around with those and find the one that will help you.
What a great way to wrap up. I'm going to be putting on my leadership lipstick tomorrow. If you want access to the roles that never get advertised, you need to be known in the right circles. The Enter the Boardroom community helps you build that network. Listeners get 10% off. Visit etb.newroll.com and use the code ENTER at checkout.